What's up, guys? It's Mr. Grays back again with part 3 of the long-term causes of the Civil War. You don't have to write any of this stuff. This is just kind of foreshadowing for you what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the early anti-slavery movement. How does it get its start? The birth of a much larger movement called the abolitionist movement. Remember, to abolish means to get rid of something. So the abolitionists want to abolish or get rid of slavery from the United States. The national impact of these movements that rise up, and then what are the political consequences down the road. So let's go ahead and get into all of this. We're going to start with the early anti-slavery movement. The first group to really rise up and speak out against slavery in large numbers was a religious group called the Quakers. If you remember back to our very first unit, we did talk about the Quakers there. Remember, William Penn was the founder of Pennsylvania. He was a Quaker. They founded this colony on the concept of religious freedom, kind of an offshoot from the Puritans in Massachusetts, who were not religiously tolerant. So the Quakers are a religious group, and one of the tenets of their religion is that they do believe that all people are equal in God's eyes. Ben Franklin, who spent much of his time in Pennsylvania, organized anti-slavery groups in and around Philadelphia. And by 1804, not only because of the Quakers, but they're the ones who really get this kick-started in the northern territories. The North had pretty much freed all the slaves in those states and outlawed slavery. So by 1804, almost every single northern state has outlawed slavery. Let's fast forward a little bit to 1817 in a group called the American Colonization Society. This is a group that, if you look at the name, they want to colonize something. They are an anti-slavery group that want to emancipate. Remember, emancipate means to free. The Emancipation Proclamation was the proclamation that was supposedly freeing slaves, issued by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. So they want to get rid of slavery. They want to free all the slaves, but they also realize that keeping the slaves in the United States might not be so practical and such a good idea because there's a lot of racism. And if you keep them in the United States, a lot of the people in the North who were against outlawing slavery, like they didn't really like the idea of slavery, thought it was an evil thing, but they also didn't necessarily want to free the slaves because they knew they would come up north in big numbers. They definitely would want to leave the South, come up north, and they would be competition for jobs for a lot of the white population in the North. So there's a couple of reasons they don't really think it's the best idea to keep the slaves, the former slaves, in the United States once they're freed. So they come up with the idea to colonize parts of Africa, to take those freed slaves and transport them back to Africa. Because after all, that's where they came from, right? At least that was their thing. So the American Colonization Society basically wants to establish new colonies in Africa for those slaves, a new place for them to live once they're freed. That's their goal. But then we have a larger movement called the abolitionist movement. Remember, again, to abolish slavery. Abolish is to get get rid of something. So this all starts with the Second Great Awakening. Remember back to early in this semester, we talked about the Great Awakening, which is kind of like a religious revival, renewed passion for your religion. So you kind of have this happen all over again. During the intervening time between the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, there was kind of a falling off of some of the religious passion and fervor in the United States. So when you kind of have another rebirth of religion in the United States, part of this religious rebirth is going to be encouraging the view that slavery is a sin, kind of coming back to your religious roots and your moral roots with God. And they essentially were saying slavery is a sin. If slavery is a sin, then it should be abolished. You can't compromise on it. If it's a sin, it must be completely eradicated. Because if you live with sin willingly and you understand that this is a sin and you continue to do it willingly and openly, then that is essentially diabolical and you will not be able to live your everlasting life in heaven with God, which is one of their beliefs. So this is a much more radical type of abolitionism that starts from the Second Great Awakening because it's mixed with their religion. You guys all know, if you're religious, you know how deeply you believe in your religion and how deeply you hold those thoughts and those beliefs. So if you mix in abolitionism with religious beliefs, now people are going to believe it with a religious fervor and a religious passion that is just not going to go away. So this is really going to kind of kickstart that really heavy, hardcore abolitionist movement. You don't have to write these guys' names down yet. We're going to talk about each one of them. Here are some of the leading abolitionist leaders in the United States, some of the anti-slavery leaders. You got William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman. I imagine you probably heard of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, maybe not so much William Lloyd Garrison, but he was a fiery advocate of emancipation. So let's start with him, since we probably haven't heard too much about him before. He was a newspaper publisher. He was the publisher of a newspaper called The Liberator, which is a very, very militant, which means like hardcore, anti-slavery newspaper that was based out of Boston. He did not hold back at all. He unleashed a fury against the proponents of slavery. His basic belief in terms of abolition was that he believed in immediate emancipation of slaves right now. We're not waiting. And oh, by the way, when we free the slaves, we're not going to give the slave owners a cent. We're not going to compensate them at all, because that was one of the major arguments of the slave owners. Like, hey, this is our property. If you free the slaves and take our property from us, we spent money on that. When are we going to get repaid? How do we get our money back for that? Well, that was one of the holdups of this whole, like, hey, let's free the slaves movement. So William Lloyd Garrison says, well, screw you guys. It's just not happening. You're the ones that were evil in the first place and bought people and called them property, so you don't get any money. Nothing for you. He actually was so radical, he even burned the United States Constitution. He burned it as a pro-slavery document, because in the Constitution it doesn't really specifically mention slavery really at all. So in his mind, if the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, it would flat out outlaw slavery. It would not allow it to continue. So he felt like the founding fathers kind of compromised on the issue of slavery and kind of sacrificed their morals in the process. So he burns the Constitution because he believes it's a pro-slavery document. That just shows you how deeply he believed in these abolitionist concepts. Then you have a guy named Frederick Douglass. I'm sure you've heard of him before somewhere along the way. He was probably the most well-known and most influential of the abolitionists. Part of that is because he kind of had some credibility about him. He was a former slave. He escaped earlier in his life, and he was now living, at this point when he's an abolitionist, he's living in the North as a freedman, and he goes around telling his stories about what slavery is like and pursuing the cause of emancipation for the slaves that are still in bondage in the South. He also produced an abolitionist newspaper. His was not called The Liberator. That was William Lloyd Garrison. His was called the North Star. Essentially, the North Star, follow the North Star on the Underground Railroad and you get to freedom. That's what a lot of the slaves were trying to escape. That's what they followed all the way up north. So it kind of made sense for him to name his newspaper the North Star. He also was a pretty prolific writer. He wrote quite a few books. He famously wrote basically an autobiography. It says biography, it's really an autobiography. The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass, kind of outline what life was like in slavery, his escape, and his efforts to abolish slavery after he got his freedom. Then you have Miss Harriet Tubman, another person I know you guys have heard of before, so let's not spend too much time on her. She's the conductor, quote unquote, of the Underground Railroad, because that's in quotations, the word conductor, because it wasn't exactly a railroad. It was basically just a pathway to escape from slavery in the South, from bondage to freedom in the North. So she had helped a lot of slaves escape through the Underground Railroad, over 300. We don't have an exact number. We know it was over 300 slaves that she did help escape through her time helping them along the Underground Railroad. So obviously, big time importance here as an abolitionist. And then you have a pair of sisters, we'll go with that. Some sisters who we talked about a little bit with the women's rights movement, but they weren't just focused on women's rights. They also wanted to help slaves get their freedom as well. They were actually Southern women, the Grimke sisters, Southern women who saw firsthand, really, how horrible slavery was, the absolute horrors of slavery. They saw this firsthand as children living on a plantation actually in South Carolina. So when they see these things, it stays with them for the rest of their lives. So they support equality for African Americans, but they also support equality for women, political equality, voting, property owning, things of that nature. That's what we talked about them with the Seneca Falls Convention as well. So these women here, the Grimke sisters, are pretty prolific when it comes to fighting for equality for the minority groups, whether it's African Americans or women. Well, let's look at how each section of the country, the South and the North, how they responded to this abolitionist movement. Now, of course, the Southerners are very much against abolition, and they have a couple arguments. Let's start with them first. What are the Southern arguments against abolition? What are their arguments for why they need to be allowed to keep slaves? The first one is pretty basic for them. Slavery is just simply essential to the Southern economy. The Southern economy just cannot work without slaves, because it requires so much labor. It's so labor intensive out there in these large plantations that you've got to have slaves in order for the economy to actually work. Well, you could pay some small white farmers, sure, but then by paying them, that's going to cut into the economic well-being of the South. So to them, slavery is essential to their economy. They also argue that slavery is essential to the northern economy. Because think about it. All those factories up north, that's great. But they kind of just sit there idle with nothing to do without the raw materials like cotton coming up from the south. So it's extraordinarily important for the South to be able to grow their cotton, then ship it up north for them to put into their factories and actually produce the finished product, the cloth. So if you get rid of slavery, according to the Southerners, well, not only are you hurting the Southern economy, but you're going to hurt the Northern economy as well. You're going to hurt the entire economy of the United States. It might entirely collapse altogether. So that's an argument they use to great effect as well. Here's essentially what I just said. The textile mills in the North, they depend on cotton. And they also said slavery was sanctioned by the Bible and had been around for centuries. So that's another argument. It's a religious argument here. So you get the Quakers up north who are saying this is evil, it's a sin. Well, Southerners say, hey, look at the Bible. There's plenty of slavery talk in the Bible. It's been sanctioned by the Bible. It's been approved by the Bible. It's been around for centuries. So we're no worse than anyone else. And they also are going to mention that the idea that slavery in America was actually better for the slaves in their lives in Africa. Because in Africa, their life was barbaric. In the United States, yeah, they're in bondage, but at least they're treated civilized. Now, that we know that wasn't always the case. There were some slaves that were treated horribly. Some were treated a little more humanely. So their argument is that slavery is civilized. At least they have some sort of civilized existence rather than run around as borderline cavemen in Africa in a barbaric society there without rules, without laws, anything like that. So those are the Southern arguments. Now, on the other hand, the abolitionists argue, they don't buy those arguments. They argue that slavery itself denies basic freedoms. Those natural rights that we talked about are all throughout the United States Constitution, through the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and property. Well, it's kind of hypocritical on one hand to say that life, liberty, and property is essential rights for everyone else, but then you completely deny those to African Americans just because they happen to be from another country, from another continent, and have a different colored skin. They also argue that it's degrading to humanity for people to be stuck in bondage, be treated like cattle, basically, treated like property when they're really, truly human beings. They also said, well, you know what? You say that slavery is civilized in America, all you people in the South, but really the food, the shelter, all that provided by the master is insufficient. That's not good enough for them to really have any kind of quality of life. It said destroys family, which is very true. If you get auctioned as a slave, families are broken up time and time again. Because let's say you have a family of 4. You got a man, wife, and 2 children. Well, one guy might come up and he just wants the father. He just wants to buy him. He doesn't have enough money to buy the other ones. He doesn't really care about the other ones. Somebody else comes by the mother because they need more of a house slave, a house servant. And then the kids are kind of left to fend for themselves. So it absolutely destroys families. Slavery is a violent institution with some of the overseers and how they treated slaves who don't necessarily buy into the system and trying to keep them in line. That violence is used heavily. The convention is also hypocritical. On one hand, Declaration of Independence, U.S. Constitution, all about natural rights that people have that you're born with that nobody can take away from you. So that supposedly is the case for everyone but slaves? How does that work? So it's very hypocritical. Let's continue here. Nat Turner's Rebellion was one of the major events of this era leading up to the Civil War. This was a major slave rebellion that happened in 1833. It killed 55 whites. 55 white people were killed, and many of those were women and children that were murdered during this slave rebellion. What was the result of this? Well, Southerners now begin to fear the abolitionist movement as dangerous, because the way they see it now, if you're from the South, it's like, okay, these Northerners, they're putting all these thoughts in the heads of the slaves, and they're kind of rattling them up, getting them fired up to the point that now they think that if they can just escape from my plantation, they'll have a welcoming home for them up north. And how do you escape? Well, that's right. You got to rise up and you got to kill white people. You got to kill women. You got to kill children. So Southerners are now scared of the abolitionist movement. They always hated it, but now it scares them as something that's dangerous and can lead their slaves to rise up and start flat out murdering people in an insurrection. So now what this does is it breeds more distrust of the government. And also breeds even more distrust of the people up north. And the Southerners just don't trust the federal government to really have their best interest at heart. And as a response to Nat Turner's Rebellion, the Southerners are going to pass stricter, harsher slave codes to keep the slaves more so in line than they had been before. They might have had a little bit more freedom, not much, but more freedom than they will afterwards. Because after this rebellion, they're scared to death. So they want to make sure they keep their slaves in line with very harsh, strict slave codes. In the North, abolitionists were actually unpopular because the textile mills depended on Southern cotton. And if you abolish slavery, then where is that cotton going to come from? You can't get it. So then the mills are sitting there with nothing to do. People don't have jobs because there's no cotton to run through the mills.